Good afternoon. It's Thursday, March the 29th, and here's what's happening.
Save me. Somebody save me. Yeah.
There were no visible injuries.
Begging you to save me.
The video is very grainy.
Yeah.
I just heard a loud gunshot sound, and then the screaming stopped.
Trayvon fell back and said, "You got me." That's what the police initially told me. That was bull.
The lead investigator told me this was absolutely not self-defense and they needed to prove it.
It's been more than a month since a 17-year-old unarmed black teenager called Trayvon Martin was shot dead in Sanford, Florida. The shooter, George Zimmerman, has claimed that he killed the teenager in self-defense. But an extended and newly released surveillance video is now raising serious questions about the veracity of Zimmerman's story. Here are new angles, never seen before, showing George Zimmerman handcuffed being brought into the Sanford police station 4 hours after what he claims was a life and death struggle that ended in Trayvon Martin's death. Yet the tape seems to show no sign of the injuries that Zimmerman's father and lawyer claim that he sustained, alleging that Trayvon Martin attacked him, breaking his nose and slamming the back of his head against the sidewalk. Attorneys for both sides are weighing in on the release of that video.
There absolutely was some misleading the public when they said his nose was broken and there was blood on the back of his head. There's no blood on his clothes.
The video is very grainy, and I'm not sure that it has, as far as being able to see the injuries that were recently sustained and then later cleaned up from, clearly if the report shows that he was cleaned up before he was taken in the squad car.
And we are also hearing for the first time from the family of George Zimmerman, Zimmerman's father breaking his silence in a local Fox interview, saying Trayvon threatened his son.
In doing so, his firearm was shown. Trayvon Martin said something to the effect of, "You're going to die now, or you're going to die tonight."
Joining us now from Sanford, Florida, MSNBC contributor Joyanne Reid, who's also the managing editor for thegrio.com, who's been following details of the story and doing an outstanding job. Joyanne, I know you've been looking at the new angles on these surveillance tapes, just as I have. Does it seem to you that we're looking at a man who had his nose broken in a fight to the death just hours before?
Well, see, therein lies the problem, Martin. I think that in this case, George Zimmerman is the victim of the escalating stories that he's been telling, right? His surrogates have been describing this increasingly dramatic, violent, horrific struggle between George Zimmerman and a teenager who was something like 30 pounds lighter than him, smaller than him. You see him in the tape that he looks bulky. He doesn't look chunky like he did before. He actually looks like he's in pretty good shape. And what he's claiming isn't backed up by now what we're seeing as the visual evidence of his appearance after this supposed life and death struggle, where, just remember, he has said that he was being pummeled, punched over and over and over again by Trayvon Martin, that Martin pinned both his arms down, but he somehow got them free in order to get his gun, that he was having his head slammed repeatedly into the concrete, that his nose was broken with one punch, Joe Oliver, his friend, said. You don't see any of evidence of that on the videotape, and obviously his friends and his father didn't see this tape before they made those stories public.
Indeed. I mean, I've broken my nose myself playing sport, and I can tell you I didn't look like Mr. Zimmerman does in that.
And then the Congressional Black Caucus, the NAACP, every organization imaginable is trying to get notoriety or profit from this in some way. But there's so much hate.
All of this while suggesting that nobody should rush to judgment, so long as that, of course, doesn't include judging the character of Trayvon Martin. Joining me now in New York, MSNBC political analyst Jonathan Alter, columnist for the Bloomberg View, and in Washington, MSNBC political analyst David Korn, Washington bureau chief for Mother Jones magazine, and the author of a new book entitled Showdown. David, In your book, you mention the attacks on the president and write, the birthers conspiracy theory reflected a predominant theme within the conservative opposition. Obama was the other, somehow not quite a real American who truly understood and treasured the nation. So I guess that when the president offers condolences to the parents of Trayvon Martin, he's immediately attacked by Newt Gingrich for doing so, and now the father of George Zimmerman talks about all the hate that's going around. Where's the hate coming from, David?
Well, you know, it may have come from the barrel of that gun that night. I mean, Newt Gingrich is, if you remember Jurassic Park, the Dilophosaurus, the dinosaur that spits toxic poison.
Yes.
I mean, to say that the president was suggesting it would be okay if this had been a white young man who had been shot, I mean, is not only absurd and ridiculous, it's playing the race card that Newt's accusing the president of playing. It's just wrong. He is identifying, and he's commenting on the obvious that this may be, he wasn't saying for sure, but might be one facet of this tragedy. You know, I'm kind of inclined to give any parent in this situation a bit of a pass. I think, you know, George Zimmerman's father's comments won't mean a lot when we put into context at the end of the investigations and we know for sure what happened. But for Newt to get out there and try to stir this up and suggest that Barack Obama is anti-white, now that was really despicable. But what do you expect when you're in the death throes of a campaign?
Well, John, but John, David's right, isn't he? I mean, Gingrich has been playing this line throughout the campaign, referring to the president of the food stamps president previously. In Louisiana last night, somebody shouting that the president has is a Muslim and wants to destroy the country, and Gingrich not clarifying the matter at all, just letting it go.
Okay, here's what I would like MSNBC and the rest of the media to do. Sheldon Adelson has now pulled the plug on the Gingrich campaign, right? So it's already on life support. His campaign is basically over. Why don't we just all agree that Gingrich is not going to be the nominee, he's not going to be the president, and in the same way that we don't quote Denny Hastert, who was Speaker of the House, that Newt Gingrich from this day forward be consigned where he belongs, the dustbin of history. He's yesterday's news. He's a figure from the 1990s. It's of no consequence what he says. We had to pay attention to him when he was a serious presidential candidate. He's not anymore. Let's expunge him from our consciousness.
The problem with that, John, is that by saying the sort of things he says, it encourages others, like the Daily Caller, like Glenn Beck's The Blaze, to whip up the kind of rhetoric that is so deeply problematic.
So he was in a position to do that as a presidential candidate. He's no longer in that position. There's nobody, including him, who expects that he will be the Republican nominee. So, you know, every so often, the media needs to kind of take a step back and say, is this person newsworthy any longer? Does the filth that comes out of his mouth have, is it of consequence? It is no longer of consequence. It's because he's not a potential president. It's just garbage and should not be covered.
David, do you support John's view?
Well, I hadn't thought of it. I think it's just a matter of nanoseconds before Newt Gingrich is back on Fox News without audience and being, you know, in the bloodstream in that way. But I do think, you know, perspective is worthwhile here. And my guess, John, is we've seen the print media pull its reporters off the Gingrich campaign, a lot of the media. So I think that, you know, whether there is a signed declaration of ignorance when it comes to Newt Gingrich, you know, he's going to get the equivalent of the silence treatment pretty soon.
John, going back to the case itself, George Zimmerman's father told the local Fox News reporter that his son is not racist and, quotes, he's colour blind. But given his multiple 911 calls on alleged vagrants of colour, not to mention the Trayvon case, are you sure about that?
Well, when you listen to the tape in the Trayvon case of the 911 call, he doesn't use the N-word, but he's basically making a very disparaging comment about Trayvon Martin being black, and you know, as if that in itself is cause for suspicion. He didn't say he has a hoodie, but he said he was black, and you hear the 911 dispatcher saying, "Don't follow him." don't follow. They know that this guy is a potential vigilante who is, going to take the law into his own hands, and is, possibly going to cause big problems. They should have reined him in earlier than this, but because of the loose gun laws in Florida, there was really nothing they could do about him.
David, if I can ask you finally, this is a case, is it not, of racial profiling?
It may well be. We just don't know yet what was in his head, his heart, George Zimmerman's, although the circumstances don't look favorable to him. The other aspect of this is how the police responded, and whether because of the color of the victim they did anything than they otherwise would do. If it had been a young white teenager whose body they had, would they have moved quicker? Would they have looked at the cell phone to see who his last calls were? I mean, the investigation seems rather sloppy, and often, racial profiling works not just in the terms of the perpetuation of a crime, but how a crime is handled and how people are judged after the fact.
A kind of institutional racism. David Corn and Jonathan Alter, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but thank you both.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back.